My name is Ava M. Reed. I'm 33 years old, and as of last week, I became the youngest admiral in United States history. But 2 nights ago, I sat quietly at the far end of a long family table, unnoticed, unacknowledged, while everyone raised their glasses to my sister Madison. They called her brilliant, a strategic genius, a woman who made it on her own, my uncle said, nodding at her like she had invented the alphabet. My cousin added, unlike some people, she knows how to finish what she starts. Everyone laughed. Even my mother managed a small, proud smile, something I hadn't seen directed at me in more than a decade. I said nothing. I chewed my salad slowly. I counted the cracks in the ceramic plate. And when my nephew, all of 8 years old, leaned over and asked, "Are you still doing that feelings project, the one nobody wanted?" That's when I felt something in my chest collapse. Not out of shame, just clarity. But I still said nothing. Then, just as the dessert came out, my father reached for the remote. The TV in the living room blinked on. They wanted to watch the nightly news. It was routine, background noise, until it wasn't. Fox News cut to a breaking report. A crisp anchor in a Navy suit stared into the camera and said, "Tonight we spotlight a story the nation should know. Ava M. Reed, 33, has been confirmed as the youngest U.S. admiral in American history, following a classified strategic innovation credited with saving hundreds of lives across global operations." The room froze. Forks stopped midair. My brother dropped his glass. Even my mother couldn't speak. No one looked at me, but I didn't need them to. I leaned back in my chair, folded my napkin, and whispered in my head what I had waited years to hear. Now you see me. I wasn't always invisible. Once I wore the Navy uniform with pride, the bars on my shoulder firm against my skin. I served in psychological operations, what they called the gray zone of conflict, where emotion and intellect had to dance without stepping on each other. At first they praised me. My assessments were sharp, my instincts accurate. Commanders would ask for my input before major deployments, especially in conflict zones, where reading intentions could be the difference between bloodshed and breakthrough. But the tide turned during one mission. I questioned a planned raid, not out of fear, but because I sensed the intel was off. The locals were giving signs we were missing. The data was too clean. I advised caution. They called it hesitation. I spoke up again. They said I was letting empathy cloud judgment. And when I requested a delay just 72 hours, they labeled me too sensitive to lead. That label stuck like tar. 3 days later, the raid went ahead. 4 civilians died. 2 of ours too. But no one came back to correct the record. They needed a scapegoat. And I was perfect. They reassigned me to desk work. No more field decisions, they said. Weeks later, the paperwork arrived. My role was no longer operationally relevant. No hearing, no closure. I came home that fall quietly. I remember the first family dinner. My sister passed me a slice of pie and said, "Well, I guess not everyone's cut out for pressure." My uncle joked, "Should have been a therapist, sweetheart, or a secretary." Laughter again. I smiled like it didn't matter. But something inside me closed. I didn't try to explain. I didn't ask them to see me. I just disappeared. No more social media. No more Navy connections. No more family updates. People assumed I broke down. But in truth, I was just beginning to build something. Something they couldn't mock. Something they'd never see coming. People thought I was dismissed. Dishonorably discharged. Broken. But here's what no one ever knew. I wasn't kicked out. I withdrew under direct request from a program that doesn't officially exist. It was a Thursday. I had just returned from the final debrief when 2 men in plain clothes asked to speak with me. No rank, no insignia. Just a thin silver envelope and a single question. "Would you consider helping us build something quieter?" I didn't ask for details. Not then. But within weeks I was relocated. No base, no uniform, no contact with the world I knew. And that's where EMR began. Emotional mapping response. It's not a weapon, it's a lens, a way to read intentions, fear, and instability across the battlefield, not through cameras or drones, but through behavior patterns, biometric shifts, and emotional footprints. We designed it to protect, not punish, to catch the tremor in a voice before the bomb is built, to read the look in a child's eyes before the wrong side recruits him, to see before it's too late. But here's the catch. The system wasn't mine. No patent bore my name. No press release mentioned my existence. I signed away credit for every breakthrough. Because that was the condition: anonymity. I chose silence over spotlight, impact over applause. I spent years refining that algorithm, feeding it with every lesson, every failure, every scar. Even the pain from my own family, how their rejection had patterns too. But when the program launched under someone else's name, I didn't flinch, because I knew what it could do. And I didn't need anyone to know it came from me, at least not yet. They didn't walk me out with disgrace. There was no courtroom, no shouted accusations, no formal stripping of titles. Just a quiet shift, like being erased in slow motion. They started pulling me from operational briefings, then from meetings entirely. Eventually, I was told my clearance was being reviewed for alignment purposes. That's when I was called into Captain Rowan's office. He didn't stand when I entered. He didn't ask me to sit. He just motioned to a single line on a piece of paper, then looked at me like I was the problem no one wanted to solve. "You think too much," he said flatly. "Officers don't get to second-guess the emotions of enlisted men. We need action, not interpretation." I stood in front of him, hands at my sides. I said nothing. Not yet. "They cry, they panic, they break, fine," he continued. "But you're not here to feel that. You're here to move through it. So if you can't, we'll find someone who can." That should have been the end of it, but I looked him in the eye and said one sentence I knew he wouldn't forget. "Sir, maybe if someone had interpreted earlier, they wouldn't be breaking now." He didn't respond. He just signed the paper, my reassignment. But I didn't spend that time sulking. I started observing, quietly. Late at night, I watched the younger soldiers, their hands shaking, before lights out, the hollow look in their eyes after mission briefings. The ones who cracked loud weren't the only ones suffering. I kept a notebook. I tracked patterns, how their speech changed, their posture, how some avoided mirrors, how others stared too long. No one asked what I was doing. I wasn't in anyone's chain of command anymore, but I wasn't wasting time. I dug into studies on PTSD, read old Soviet reports on emotional fatigue, analyzed biometric wearables from elite units. I even watched footage from humanitarian crises, how aid workers process trauma in silence. I saw it everywhere. Emotional fracture wasn't chaos. It was patterned, predictable, mappable. I started sketching early drafts of what would later become the EMR grid. Color-coded layers of emotional volatility, triggers, compensation behaviors, false stability indicators. I cross-referenced it with language models and voice stress cues. And slowly a system emerged. One night while reviewing tapes in the archives, I found something haunting. A sergeant, one who had taken his own life weeks after deployment, had logged 27 behavioral shifts in the final week. 27. And no one flagged it. I didn't cry. I didn't get angry. I circled each marker in red ink, then opened a clean sheet. What could have been caught, I wrote. What still can be. By the time the plainclothes officers approached me, the ones who offered the silver envelope, I had a binder full of what I called emotional trace theory. And even after I accepted the classified post, I kept researching on the side. Because while the military had shown me the limits of their system, they'd also shown me its gaps. So no, I didn't really leave the Navy. I just stopped wearing the uniform. But I was still watching, still building. And I knew one day I'd need to bring what I learned back into the world, where it could matter, where it could save the ones they kept overlooking, where it could save me. The transition wasn't glamorous. There was no ceremony, no formal goodbye. My records were sealed under internal reclassification codes. My identity removed from active personnel databases, emails deleted, photographs pulled from archives. Officially, I no longer existed. I became a shadow in a nameless program, a quiet presence within a training facility known only to a handful of internal behavioral units. No badge, no rank, just a passcode and a room with a two-way mirror. For 3 years, I worked from behind the glass. I embedded myself inside the training pipeline, not in combat prep, but in psychological readiness drills. We called them non-linear immersion simulations. That's where I tested EMR quietly, patiently, ethically. I didn't tell the recruits what I was watching for. I just listened. Tension patterns, word repetition, unconscious pacing, sudden silence. Every cue was data. Every sigh was a signal. I tracked over 240 participants, new recruits and returning veterans. Some broke early, some hardened too fast, but some just disappeared behind their smiles. Like Logan. He was 22. Reclassified after a roadside blast fractured his femur and shattered 3 ribs. But it wasn't the physical injury that concerned us. It was the way he laughed. Not joyfully, mechanically. His eyes would flatten mid-sentence. His voice pitched upward, trying too hard to sound normal. His EMR trace glowed in pale orange, a state we called emotional dissociation. In simpler terms, he wasn't processing pain, he was outrunning it. Logan had no outward signs of collapse, no rage, no visible fear. But his internal rhythm, it was out of sync. We brought him in for a one-on-one. He cracked jokes, deflected, tried to charm his way through. So I showed him the grid. I said, "You're not broken, Logan. You're in denial. That's not weakness. That's survival." For a moment he froze. Then he whispered, "So it's not just in my head." "No," I said. "It's in your patterns. And those can be remapped." That's when I realized something vital. I wasn't curing anyone. I was giving them language for things they didn't know they were allowed to feel. Some cried. Some sat still for hours. Some went back into the field with new clarity. And that's when I knew EMR worked. Not because it fixed people, but because it gave them back to themselves. The system was still unofficial, still buried under layers of non-disclosure and plausible deniability. But the lives it touched, they were real. And I kept every trace file, for memory, for proof, for something I couldn't name yet. There were nights I'd watch the monitors and feel the urge to step back into the world. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. It would take one final choice, one request I hadn't anticipated to bring me back into the open. And when it came, I wouldn't be hiding behind glass anymore. It happened on a Thursday, the kind of day that felt normal, predictable. I had just finished reviewing onboarding assessments for a new Energy One behavioral analytics team when a coworker sent a live link. "Thought this might interest you," he wrote. No context, just a government seal and the words, "Congressional Hearing Innovation in National Defense Readiness." I clicked. The feed loaded slowly, static. A chamber half filled with suits and badges. Then the camera settled on a familiar silhouette at the podium. Madison, my sister. Her posture was perfect, voice, crisp. The same trained warmth she used in job interviews and press briefings. She wore a navy blue blazer, the one she always chose when she needed to look in charge, but relatable. And then I heard it. "What you see behind me," she said, gesturing to a large screen, "is the Emotional Mapping Response Framework, EMR. I stopped breathing. Developed through our Joint Civilian-Military Communications Strategy Division, she continued. EMR allows us to trace pre-traumatic disruption patterns in real time. It gives commanders foresight into mental vulnerability without compromising mission flow. No mention of neural trace metrics. No mention of behavioral drift vectors. No mention of me. It was a collaborative project, she said smoothly, but I was proud to lead the communications alignment team that first identified its integration potential. I stared at the screen. There it was, my system, stripped down, sanitized, presented like it had emerged fully formed from some boardroom brainstorm. But the structure, the grid, the language mine, not just the theory but the anomalies, the conditional thresholds, the exact predictive markers I had tested, refined, and buried in notebooks no one else had seen. I paused the video, took a breath. There were 2 versions of me in that moment. The first, the sister, the daughter, wanted to believe it was an accident, that maybe Madison had misunderstood or had been given faulty sourcing or didn't realize where the foundations came from. But the second version, the observer, knew better. This wasn't oversight, it was orchestration. Madison hadn't just used EMR. She had packaged it, wrapped it in civilian terminology, attached it to her team's branding, filed it under military-civilian liaison strategy. And most of all, she'd made herself its face. I didn't text her, I didn't email. I just closed the laptop, sat still, and then I went to the basement. I pulled out the old steel case, the one I hadn't opened in years. Inside, 17 field notebooks. Printouts of every session recording, the original sketch of the EMR Diamond model, a flash drive labeled Logan VR4. I laid them out like evidence, not because I wanted revenge. Not yet. I just wanted truth to have a spine. A paper trail. I began cataloging timestamps, entries, file versions. Every version of EMR from the earliest pencil drafts to the working models I had shared under closed-loop review protocols. None of them bore Madison's name. I compiled a timeline. First sketch, month 1. Year 1, first test, month 3. First cross-validation with PTSD trace, month 5. Madison hired at Dignia Solutions, month 9. She hadn't even been in the building when the groundwork was laid. She hadn't seen the tears, the breakdowns, the breakthroughs. She had waited, then stepped in. I didn't cry, I didn't curse. I just whispered aloud, "This isn't about credit. It's about history being rewritten with me erased." And history I'd learned was more fragile than memory. So I began reconstructing mine line by line. Because when the time came, I wouldn't just be defending an idea. I'd be defending the truth of who I had always been, long before anyone saw it fit to acknowledge. It wasn't always like this. Madison and I used to talk late into the night, back when our rooms were divided by a thin wall and our dreams overlapped in whispered promises of doing something that mattered. She used to braid my hair before school. I used to write speeches for her student council campaigns. We weren't just sisters, we were mirrors. So when she called me 2 years ago and asked for help, I didn't hesitate. "Hey," she'd said, her voice light but edged. "We're developing a non-profit pilot civil-military trust building. There's a behavioral component I think you'd be perfect for." I paused. "You mean like trauma-informed leadership?" "Exactly, something light. Just a framework. Not public-facing." She asked if I had any existing templates, something she could use as a discussion starter for a cross-functional roundtable. I sent her a demo, a redacted version of EMR basic schematics, non-sensitive outputs. I even included a note: "Use this as context only. It's not validated for external use." She texted back, "Got it. You're the best. Love you." That was the last time we spoke. I forgot about it, buried myself in new work. And then came the hearing, and her face on every news channel. That wasn't just betrayal. It was premeditated repackaging. Because what she presented to Congress wasn't a framework. It was the entire model rebuilt, renamed, and recast under a new coalition banner. The Coalition for Civilian Defense Alignment. Their tagline, "Bridging Hearts Before Conflict." And there it was again. My language, stripped, polished, and stapled to a corporate agenda. She didn't just use EMR. She licensed it, filed it under proprietary methodologies, applied for development grants, even launched training modules I had written for internal field mentoring. I stared at the trademark filings one night, every nerve in my body cold. Filed under Madison V. Reed, lead architect, lead architect. I read the words until they stopped making sense. And then I remembered the demo, the favor, the sisterhood I thought would protect my blind spot. I whispered I wasn't tricked because I trusted her. I was tricked because I thought she understood me. There's a difference. Trust assumes honesty. Understanding assumes care. Madison didn't just borrow my work. She translated it into a language that erased me, and for what recognition power? Or was it always just easier to build a career with borrowed bricks so long as the house looked clean from the outside? I don't know. But that night I opened my encrypted archive, the one I hadn't touched since the pilot years. I found the original transmission log, the email with the file name, the permissions flag marked internal only. And I remembered something else, something smaller. A text she sent after receiving the demo. It read, "This is genius. You could seriously change everything with this. But knowing you, you'd rather just hide and let someone else present it." I hadn't thought much of it then. But now it read like a map, a confession. She'd known exactly what she was doing, and I had handed her the keys. So I opened a blank document, titled it EMR, Genesis File Timeline. Authored AR, I began typing. Because some truths don't die. They just go quiet until someone remembers how to speak them. I didn't plan to be found. After everything I'd made peace with being invisible, quiet work, real work, that was enough. But then the emails started. Not from lawyers or officials, from soldiers. One by one they wrote, Some were just lines of thanks, some were longer, stories, remembered moments from field tests, short conversations they never forgot. You looked at me like I wasn't broken. You stopped a panic spiral just by asking me what I was afraid of, not what I was supposed to do. I read them alone. I never replied, until I saw one name I recognized. Logan. He'd been one of the first. Back then, Logan was spiraling, his hands always shaking, eyes scanning corners that weren't threats. But when we used EMR to map his emotional echo, we discovered it wasn't fear. It was guilt, misplaced and unresolved. That changed everything. He stabilized. Now his email was direct. I work for Senator Hall's team now. If you ever want the truth told, I can get you 5 minutes in the right room. I didn't reply, because I still wasn't sure if truth was the goal or just revenge in disguise. But something was shifting. The air was heavier, like a wave forming far from shore. Then I got a notification: closed Military Civilian Innovation Conference Limited Access Stream, the title Neuroethical Systems in Strategic Morale Leadership, but the subtitle made my stomach drop. Honoring Breakthroughs in Emotional Cognitive Mapping. The EMR initiative. I logged in, just to see. The live stream started, a dim stage, soft blue lights, rows of uniformed attendees in silence. Then the moderator stepped up and said, "Today, we honor the team that changed how we understand readiness, not just as physical capacity, but emotional coherence." A round of applause. And then please welcome the woman whose vision made it possible, Director of Strategic Outreach, Madison Reed. The lights shifted, applause rose, and there she was, my sister, in a navy pantsuit, confident, beaming. She walked on stage like it belonged to her. I froze. I listened as she spoke. When we first imagined EMR, she said we thought it would be a soft tool, but in time it proved to be the most resilient force in unit cohesion. Imagined she was rewriting history in real time. The audience nodded, took notes. One general even stood and said, "This system saved lives. It deserves to be standard across all training platforms." I wanted to turn it off, but I didn't. I watched to the end, and after the final applause, I opened Logan's email again, stared at his offer. "If you ever want the truth told." And for the first time, I didn't think about reputation or vindication. I thought about distortion. How easily the story had been reshaped. How silence becomes complicity. Madison didn't just take EMR. She took the context, the caution, the warnings I built into the margins. She turned a diagnostic compass into a branding tool. And they were scaling it without the guardrails. That night, I stood at my kitchen sink, holding a mug of cold tea. Outside, the street was quiet. Inside, everything roared. I whispered to myself, "If someone gets hurt because of this..." I didn't finish the sentence, but I knew the end of it, and I knew what I had to do. Logan's message stayed in my inbox for 3 days before I answered. I told him I wasn't ready to go public, but I needed a name, someone who still had access to the original EMR drafts I submitted during our trials. The private logs, the ones I wasn't supposed to keep. He gave me a single name, Dr. Elliot Harmon. He'd been our internal ethics advisor during the program's early phase. Back then, Elliot was sharp but quiet, the kind of man who always looked like he was one question ahead. He had also been the custodian of the intellectual property waivers, meaning he was the last person who signed off on whether any of my work could be used outside our unit. The trail was faint, but I found him. He was retired now, living in a modest house near Chesapeake Bay with a salt-stained porch swing and a cat named Tuesday. When he opened the door, he didn't look surprised to see me. "Just tired." "Come in," he said. "I figured you'd come one day." We sat in his kitchen. The air smelled like coffee and damp wood. I asked him if he still had the signed originals, the logs, the consent documents, anything that could prove the authorship chain. He gave me a long look. Then he said I did. Past tense. But 3 years ago, I was pressured into signing a transfer of ownership. Legalese. Quiet threats. I wasn't forced at gunpoint, Ava, but I was forced. My stomach turned. By who? He didn't answer at first. Then after a breath, Madison's legal team. I didn't speak. He kept going. They framed it as a reassignment for the greater good to ensure implementation. They brought up my pension, my license, my son's job at the agency. It wasn't stealing, not exactly. It was cornering. He looked down into his coffee. They had the power. I had a mortgage. I wanted to be angry. But I understood too well how quiet coercion worked. It was never loud, just steady. I asked him if he regretted it. He nodded, then said something I'll never forget. They've already painted over your name, Ava. But they haven't filled in the new picture yet. Don't let them draw you with their pen. I asked if he still had anything left, any backup, any evidence. He walked to the back room and came out with a thin black notebook. My handwriting, not copies, originals, diagrams, case notes, emotional pattern coding. One page even had a coffee stain and a smear of red ink from a pen that burst in my hand during a night session. He handed it to me. This won't win in court, he said. But it will win in hearts if you use it right. I clutched it tight. My fingers shook. Outside, the wind picked up. Inside, so did something else. Resolve. Elliot walked me to the door. As I stepped out, he said, I'm old. I don't have anything left to lose. But you do, so be careful. And be the one who tells your story. I nodded. And I knew where I had to go next. There was someone else I trusted. Someone who knew what it felt like to be erased and reassembled as someone else's success story. A former Marine, now a journalist. She once said stories don't die. They just wait for the right voice. It was time I found mine again. I didn't submit the file, not yet. I was still debating whether the world needed the truth or if I just needed to be free of the silence. Then one night my inbox pinged. The subject line, a gift you can't return. The sender, Marcus Ellis, a Marine I hadn't spoken to in 5 years. I'd once flagged him during a training cycle as a high-risk case, masked grief, repressed trauma, unrecognized survivor's guilt. EMR detected it through his lack of REM consistency and a pattern of humor deflection in debriefs. It saved him, quietly. Now he was thanking me, but more than that, he was acting. Attached was a press inquiry. Fox News was preparing an exposé. They'd caught wind of the discrepancies between the internal authorship logs and the official EMR launch documentation. Marcus had tipped them off. They were running a series, Who is the Woman Behind EMR? The teaser aired at 6:00 p.m. that Thursday. I didn't see it live. I didn't even know. Because I was at my parents' house. Madison had invited everyone over celebration for her supposed new consulting deal with the Federal Tech Coalition. The table was full. Wine glasses clinked. My mother wore pearls. My father made his usual joke about how Madison always lands on her feet. I sat at the far end, silent. A cousin asked if I'd gone back to school. I said nothing. Then mid-laughter, my uncle reached for the remote. Let's see what the big world is up to. He turned the TV on. Fox News. Prime Hour. A title card swept across the screen in red and white. EMR, the future of conflict resolution. Born from the mind of a ghost. There was no photo, just data. And then came the headline, AVA-M Reed, 33 U.S. Navy Analytical Command nominated for Rear Admiral. The room froze. Forks halfway to mouths. Glasses paused in midair. My mother's smile flickered, then vanished. My father blinked. Slowly. The reporter kept speaking. Sources within the Department of Defense confirmed that the emotional mapping model now being adopted by NATO intelligence units originated not from a communications office, but from a data psychologist embedded within classified training facilities between 2016 and 2020. That name, Ava Reed. No one spoke. Not Madison. Not my cousin who once called me the dropout with a laptop. Not my aunt who used to ask, are you still in that emotional stuff? They all looked at me, and I said nothing. Because what could I say? I hadn't planned this. I hadn't leaked anything. I hadn't asked to be seen. But I wasn't hiding anymore either. I sat back. The TV kept going. Footage of blurred figures. Heat maps. Quotes from unnamed sources. My name hung in the air like smoke. Finally, Madison stood. She picked up her glass and walked into the kitchen. She didn't say a word. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel triumphant either. I just felt still. Like the world had paused. Like truth finally had a shape. And it wore my name. I didn't go to the kitchen after her. I stayed at the table. The room tried to recover. Jokes started again, thin and shaky. My aunt changed the subject to someone's baby shower, but the current had shifted. I could feel it. I left early. No one stopped me. That night, I lay on my bed fully clothed, fully still staring at the ceiling as if it might give me an answer. I didn't sleep. At 2:11 a.m., my phone buzzed. Madison. Just her name on the screen made my chest tighten. I almost didn't open it, but I did. Her message read, "I didn't know. You never told me. Don't blame me for protecting my career." Nothing else, no punctuation, no explanation, just that. And I didn't reply. I turned off my phone and placed it face down on the windowsill. But her words echoed louder than any headline. I didn't know. I had never told her about EMR in full. Not about the code base or the failure tests or the sleepless nights I spent rewriting case responses for soldiers who didn't know how to cry. I had shared fragments, diagrams, observations. She had asked for those, and I'd sent them, trusting her. Not because she was my sister, but because for a fleeting second I'd wanted her to finally see me. I hadn't realized I'd kept that hope buried so deep. Now I wasn't sure if I'd been betrayed, or if I'd just never been clear enough. I thought of what Marcus had said, of the hearing request now sitting in my inbox, of the nomination that had made its way across 6 departments, each one attaching my name like a postscript to history that had almost been rewritten without me. I thought of Madison, of how she'd always known how to speak the right words at the right time, of how she was raised to survive by fitting in, of how we were both daughters in a house where being good meant being silent and being right didn't mean you got heard. And I asked myself, what am I fighting for recognition, justice? Or was this about something smaller and deeper? Was I chasing some proof that I mattered? Was I trying to undo years of being dismissed, erased, made to feel like my empathy made me weak? Was this really about EMR, or was it about me? I looked at the code folder again. The earliest version still bore the name mread alpha.v1, not Madison. Me, M for mapping. Not even a name. Just the beginning of something I wasn't brave enough to claim. Until now. Her message kept spinning in my head. Don't blame me for protecting my career. And I whispered back to the dark room, then don't blame me for reclaiming mine. The next morning I opened my laptop. I began collecting documentation, emails, timestamps, trial data, handwritten logs, even the old notebook I'd kept hidden behind the radiator vent, water damage smudged but legible. I didn't send them anywhere, not yet. Because first I needed to be honest with myself. What I was about to do wasn't just about setting the record straight. It was about shedding the silence that had shaped every corner of my life. If this was a war, it wasn't between me and Madison. It was between the woman I had to become to survive, and the woman I was meant to be all along. And this time, I wouldn't hide. They called it an honor, a rare appointment, strategic advisor to the Joint Armed Command. Civilian status, full access, lifetime clearance. A seat at the table where doctrine was shaped, not just followed. I received the envelope in person. A colonel in formal dress slid it across a polished mahogany desk like it was a gift wrapped in duty. He said I could take my time reviewing it, but he smiled like he already knew my answer. I didn't open it right away. I walked home, no motorcade, no escort. Just the sound of my boots tapping the sidewalk and the weight of history knocking against my ribs. That night I opened the file. Inside were documents from the latest deployment to a conflict zone overseas. I knew the region, I'd studied the political entanglements, but I hadn't known EMR was now fully operational there. I scanned the report. A battalion faced a moral gridlock. 2 paths. One led to a village where civilians were reported trapped under siege conditions. The other led to an injured commanding officer, vital intelligence asset codenamed Falcon. Time-sensitive, no way to split the team. The EMR system, analyzing behavioral trends, historical data, and field patterns, made a recommendation: prioritize recovery of Falcon. They followed it. The civilians died. Falcon lived. The report said the operation was a tactical success. I couldn't breathe. I flipped to the Annex Statistical Confidence Metrics. EMR had flagged the soldiers who hesitated, noted their emotional deviations, recommended desensitization training. Desensitization. I closed the folder, then I opened my oldest notebook, the one from the early EMR trials. There in blue ink smudged by rain and memory was my first thesis line: no decision made under extreme stress is purely strategic. It is always emotional. That's not a flaw. That's human. I'd written that before I'd even named the project, before I had learned to speak like a system, before I knew how to package compassion as code. Somewhere along the way, they took the engine I built to save soldiers from breaking and turned it into a filter for eliminating empathy. That wasn't the EMR I gave them, but it was the one they'd refined. And now they wanted me to bless it with a title, to wear a rank that would sanctify the outcomes. I stared at the insignia in the packet. Admiral if I wanted it, civilian if I didn't. I didn't sleep that night. At 6:30 a.m., I returned to headquarters. I placed the envelope back on the colonel's desk. He looked confused. "I thought this would be a moment of redemption for you," he said. After everything, I smiled. "It is." He waited. "I built something right," I said quietly. "But I forgot to teach them how to be human with it." He tilted his head. I nodded to the folder. When data becomes a shield against morality, no badge can fix that. Then I turned and left. No applause, no cameras. Just a decision made in full daylight. I didn't need a title to know who I was, and I wouldn't let them use my name to justify what I never meant to create. The hall was packed. Decorated officers, think tank analysts, military contractors in tailored suits, some veterans, most bureaucrats, all seated in rows of polished metal chairs inside the National Defense Convention Center. I stood behind the podium, alone. No rank on my shoulders, no uniform, just me and a microphone that hummed with anticipation. They'd invited me to speak about innovation, but I wasn't here to celebrate. I was asked to talk about technology, I said calmly, but I came to talk about consequences. The room stilled. I didn't leave the military because I was tired. I left because I couldn't watch us trade empathy for efficiency, because somewhere along the line, strategy became sanitized. I looked toward the front row. Madison wasn't there. The EMR system wasn't created to justify sacrifice. It was built to understand pain before it became violence, but it's now being used to make decisions without the weight of human conscience. A few heads turned. Some shifted uncomfortably. I was offered a rank admiral. I declined. Not because I lack ambition, but because I refused to let my name justify policies I'd never endorse. Behind me, the projector flickered on. I clicked the remote. A sentence appeared across the screen. Civilian exposure risk is within acceptable strategic loss thresholds. I let it sit there, let them read it, let them taste it. That was in the last report I reviewed. A decision made based on EMR data. And yet no one asked if it was right, only if it was acceptable. A man in a naval uniform stood. "If you had the power, would you risk the mission to save civilians?" I looked at him, measured my breath. I'd risk more than the mission. I'd risk being wrong for the sake of being decent. Some applauded, others booed. The room cracked in half. Later that day, military blogs ran headlines, "Too sensitive to lead Ava Reed's dangerous idealism," but a different headline gained traction. "Moral clarity in uniform, why Ava Reed might be right." That night as I walked to the parking garage, a young corporal followed me. "Ma'am," he said, "because of EMR." I asked for help. That system didn't just save my mind, it saved my life. I nodded. I didn't speak. But when I got home, I cried for the first time in years. Weeks passed. No call, no text, not even a vague "how are you" from anyone in my family. Just stillness, like nothing had ever happened. Then a podcast surfaced. My sister's voice, polished, composed, corporate. The interviewer asked, "Do you think Ava deserved credit for EMR?" Madison hesitated, then said, I need to be forgiven." I paused the podcast, closed my laptop, and stared at the window for a long time. Forgiven, I wasn't sure what that even meant anymore. In my EMR ethics class the next morning, I used her quote as a case study. We discussed the difference between apology and accountability. One of my students, Olivia, raised her hand. Barely 22. Still learning how to hold her own voice steady. "Do you forgive your family, Miss Reed?" I took a breath, a long one. Then I said, "I don't know." Some students looked down. Others waited, but I think I've stopped needing them to change. Silence, but not uncomfortable, thoughtful. I let the words hang. We often confuse forgiveness with closure. They're not the same. Forgiveness is accepting the truth for what it is and no longer letting it define what we build next. After class, I returned to my office. On my desk was a letter with no return address. The handwriting was tight, careful. Mail. I opened it. Ava. They still use EMR. In quiet ways. In moments that matter. One day we were about to greenlight a mission. The data said go. But I remembered what you said. No decision without human weight. I paused. Asked questions. We held back. Found something the system missed. 2 lives were saved. One of them was mine, Logan. I folded the letter, pressed it to my chest. Logan was one of the first recruits I worked with. One of the reasons I didn't give up. I walked to the same bench by the Potomac River I used to sit at when I had no clearance, no name. And I realized something. Maybe I'd never get a formal apology. Maybe my family would never call. Maybe Madison would never say the words I needed to hear. But that bench was still mine. That letter was mine. And the students who now taught EMR principles to a generation that might just lead with heart, they were mine too. I no longer needed them to remember who I was, because I never forgot. And that was enough. I called it the lighthouse, not a clinic, not a school, not a facility. Just a place that knew how to stay lit when the rest of the world turned off the lights. We opened in an old community center just outside Arlington. The rent was low, the ceilings leaked when it rained, but the windows faced the sunrise, and that was enough. There was no military logo, no flags, no ranks on the wall. People walked in as they were uniformed, civilian, bruised, unsure. Some carried files, others carried silence. We didn't fix anyone. We didn't promise clarity. We gave people space to feel loudly, honestly, without shame. We gave them questions to ask when answers felt too heavy. Every new arrival got a small card on their first day. It read, "You are not broken. You were trained to endure. Now you are learning to be whole." That quote came from one of my earliest EMR lectures. I'd said it offhand once, and someone had scribbled it in a notebook. Years later, it ended up framed in our main hallway. One wall in the foyer was left intentionally blank. On it, I printed the transcript of my defense speech, the one where I declined the Admiral rank. I printed it on parchment, not paper, and sealed it under glass. At the top bolded were the words, "I didn't leave because I couldn't lead. I left because leadership meant more than winning." Some visitors read it in silence, others wept. One Marine veteran, 62 scar along his jaw, too many medals to count, stood there for 15 minutes without moving. When he finally turned to me, he said, "I thought I'd never hear someone say that out loud." I nodded. Neither did I. We kept no client records. We didn't ask for discharge papers. We didn't care whether someone left on good terms or bad. One man arrived wearing a dishonorable discharge badge on his jacket. He said he had nowhere else to go. We found him a chair, a coffee, a name tag. We ran workshops, wrote exercises, but the most powerful moments were the quiet ones. Someone admitting they were scared. Someone saying, "I don't know who I am without the uniform." Someone laughing again for the first time in years. We never posted photos, no media tours, no PR campaigns. But word spread. Some called us radical. Some called us naive. But more came. Ava Reed, they wrote, built a place for ghosts and warriors to sit at the same table, to speak without ranks, and to heal without hiding. One night I stayed late to mop the floor. A sticky patch near the entry hadn't come up. As I scrubbed, I looked up at my own words printed on the wall. I left because leadership meant more than winning. And I whispered to myself, and maybe, this is what leadership looks like. It was a rainy Wednesday when she came. No press, no entourage. Just a gray coat damp at the sleeves and eyes that didn't look away this time. Madison stood at the entrance of the lighthouse, hands in her pockets. For a moment, I thought she might turn back, but she didn't. I met her halfway across the lobby. Neither of us reached out. No hug, no apology. Just space between us, heavy but not cruel. She looked around. The card table, the coffee station, the bulletin board with anonymous thank you notes. Her gaze stopped at the quote on the wall. My quote. I didn't leave because I couldn't lead. I left because leadership meant more than winning. I read it, she said softly. I nodded. We didn't sit. She didn't ask to tour the place. She just stood there the way people do when they don't know if they're welcome. Then she said, You may never forgive me. And I get that. But the EMR system, it was never really mine. I'm filing paperwork to restore the original authorship under your name. Full rights, copyright, everything. She wasn't crying, neither was I. But something shifted in the air like a door we both thought had rusted shut had quietly clicked open. I didn't thank her. I didn't say anything at all. Not because I wasn't moved, but because I'd spent so many years searching for the right words, only to learn that some moments aren't built for language. We stood in silence for a few more seconds. Then she added, I still don't know how to talk to you, but I'd like to try, someday. She turned to leave, rain still falling. No dramatics, no last look. When the door closed behind her, I walked back to my office, sat down in the chair that squeaked when you leaned too far back. And for the first time since we opened, I looked at the photo on the corner shelf. It was framed years ago before everything unraveled. 2 girls on a beach, matching ponytails. One of us holding a plastic microphone, the other pretending to run a radio tower. I had flipped it upside down the day she spoke in front of Congress. It had stayed that way ever since. Now, with fingers steadier than I expected, I reached up. I turned the frame around, right side up. No fanfare, no forgiveness ceremony. Just gravity realigned. Somewhere between grief and repair, a new kind of memory had started to take shape. And that was enough for now. They came in quietly, some in uniform, others in hoodies and secondhand coats. One woman with a sociology textbook half open on her lap. A young man with his prosthetic hand resting on the desk, as if it belonged there the whole time. It was the first day of the new EMR class at the lighthouse. I stood at the front holding a piece of chalk. No projector, no podium. Just a blackboard and afternoon light cutting soft stripes across the floor. You're not here because someone needed a resume line, I began. A few smiles, a few stares, a cough in the back. You're here because somewhere someone is carrying more than they're allowed to feel. And one day it might be your voice, your presence that reminds them they're not broken, just buried. The silence settled into attention. I walked to the window. The breeze moved the curtain like it was breathing. When I built EMR, it wasn't to make waves. It was to prevent drownings. A few notebooks opened, pens moved. But I want to be clear, I continued. This course isn't about me. You don't need to remember my name. What matters is that you remember this. I turned to the board and wrote 6 words in thick white chalk. No applause needed. Just live true. When I stepped aside, a shaft of sunset caught the letters just right. The room was quiet, not out of reverence, but recognition. You may never get a headline, I said. You may never get a medal. In fact, the louder you speak truth, the more people may try to erase you. I paused, looked at the young man with the prosthetic. But that doesn't mean you're wrong. They didn't clap. They didn't need to. Because some truths don't echo back, they settle in. Quiet, steady, like roots. And that was the point. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to know. Where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, we hope you carry this story with you, and remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.